an entire episode on this because, again, there's a lot of interest in this and I get that question a lot. As to the other part of the question, it's an interesting question. How can you prove to yourself that countries' banks are privately owned and controlled? Exceptionally important question, and one that we hear a lot, but I think the important point about this question is that I think it's an example of one of those questions where if they can get you to ask the wrong question or the right question in the wrong way, they can give you the pat response that is going to be very definitive and make you look very silly in front of other people. You know, oh, why did you ask that? Whereas I think the question that we want to be asking is slightly different. So again, it always comes back to this. Who owns the Federal Reserve? It's privately owned. It's these secret owners who own it. It's the Rothschilds. It's the Rockefellers. It's, you know, this and that. It's not quite that simple. So we can go to the Federal Reserve website, federalreserve.gov, and they have a standard pat answer to this on their FAQ. Who owns the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve System fulfills its public mission as an independent entity within government. It is not owned by anyone and is not a private profit-making institution. And insofar as they get to define all those terms and put it in that way, they're technically correct. It's not a profit-making institution per se. They don't make well, the profit that they make, they give back to the Treasury. And yes, there are shares that are issued through the Federal Reserve banks to the shareholders, which are the banks that make up the Federal Reserve System. So the private banks own shares in the Federal Reserve System through the reserve banks, and they get 6% dividends on that. So there is some type of profit making going on for some of the entities involved here, but you know, it's not exactly the way people mean it when they say owned, and it's not for profit, and all of these things that they get to say, look, all of you conspiracy theorists are wrong. So this is something I'm going to be talking about very specifically in my Federal Reserve documentary, how this works and what it really means. I think the real question is not who owns the Federal Reserve, it's who controls the Federal Reserve. And when we put it in those terms, it becomes much more apparent what's going on. The FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, which consists of presidents of the reserve banks, which again are drawn from the private banks, which make up those reserve banks. So it's a system that's not, it doesn't operate in the way that I think it would be easy to understand. Oh, you know, Bank X or person Y owns the Federal Reserve. It's that it's controlled through these mechanisms, which theoretically, yes, the Federal Reserve was put into place by Congress and can be repealed by an act of Congress. Not that it ever will be, or at least not in the current political climate, but they can at least say that, and there is some truth to that, and they get to put it in that context. So that's the context that's really important. It's not who owns it, it's who controls it. And on that note, again, there's often things that go around the web talking about there's only, you know, 3 central banks that aren't privately owned, and these are the 3. That's like Iraq and Iran and North Korea, and so they invaded Iraq, or whatever it is. These lists go around, and I've seen different ones in different being propounded in different ways by different people. Again, I don't think it's really about that. It's not about who owns the central banks per se, it's about how they're run and who directs and controls them. And to get a better sense of that, and the list of the countries that are on the globalist inside, I think we should go to the Central Bank for Central Banks, identified by Carol Quigley as the apex of the pyramid back in Tragedy and Hope, the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, which very few people even know exists, and the few people that do don't understand what it is or how it works. An exceptionally important organization that I am going to be doing more work on in the future because of its importance. But on their website, they have an About section, and they list their organization, including the members who are the central banks or monetary authorities of, and it gives the list of all the central banks that participate in the Bank for International Settlements. And there you go. Those are the list of the bankster insider controlled central banks. And it doesn't mean that necessarily that they're owned outright by various people. It means they're controlled. And in there, of course, you'll find Canada, of course, you'll find Japan, of course, you'll find the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Central Bank, Italy, Israel, Indonesia, Canada, Chile, I already said that, China, Russia. No, they're against this New World Order. No, they're a part of it. Germany, France, Australia, Austria. I mean, that's the real list. So go take a look at that. And again, there will be more to say about that because the BIS is such an important and such an understudied organization, even in the alt media. All right, thank you again for that, Ian. Let's turn to Jack, who writes, I have been surprised by the huge amount of attention Thomas Piketty is receiving for his recent book, Capital in the 21st Century. Admittedly, it is a truly excellent body of work, but wonderful economists such as Michael Hudson have been saying essentially the same thing for many years. So why was the New Yorker, New York Times, and Paul Krugman, The Economist, and even Foreign Affairs so interested in his work? I then noticed one of his solutions to the highlighted inequality issue, a global wealth tax. Does this suddenly raise the same red flags for you as it does for me? Yes, thank you for the question, and the answer is yes, it does raise some red flags. And again, the best propaganda is not 100% flat-out stinking lies. It's not something that you could point out and laugh at because it's just so blatantly false. The best propaganda is pointing out a lot of true things and then coming to grossly erroneous conclusions based on them, or even subtly erroneous. Again, it can be quite more subtle than sometimes we think. So, there's a lot to say about that, and about Thomas Piketty, and about Capital in the 21st Century, and the way it's the messiah for a lot of these insider globalist economists who love its conclusion. And I agree with, again, I agree with some of the things he's saying. There are some problems with his methodology that have been pointed out by other writers, but I agree broadly speaking that income inequality is a growing problem, not because I disagree with the idea of a free market operating and people being just unequal in various positions because of their performance or lack thereof, or the market the way it goes, but because it is structurally inherent in the way that the crony capitalist system is set up, that it will be the insiders, the globalists, the well-connected few who continue to aggrandize themselves at the expense of everyone else. And that's something that I think we should all be concerned about. But putting that in the right perspective and then getting the right conclusion from all of that, not global wealth tax, not more government. Oh yes, government, please save us from these capitalists that you're in bed with. That's absolutely ridiculous. So an excellent article that I just read yesterday that I will recommend to everyone is up on dollarvigilante.com right now. It is by Mark Jeftovic, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. It's called Cronyism in the 21st Century. Excellent analysis, lots of good material in there. I think really takes Piketty to task, and in a smart way with a lot of good references. So I will point that out to you. I will put it in the show notes. Please do go read through it. And I think that that's the real answer to Piketty, and the reason why he's being pimped so hard right now by the powers that shouldn't be. All right, next on another monetary note, we have Isaac, who starts off his email by saying that he, like myself, points to the Money Masters as one of the formative documentaries that helped him to understand the Federal Reserve System and the monetary system better. But he says, I'm emailing you to ask about two documents that Bill Still's thesis, Bill Still, the host of the Money Masters and a researcher in his own right, two documents that Bill Still's thesis somewhat relies on, the Hazard Circular and the Panic Circular. Have you found original source documentation on these documents? In the newest Bill Still documentary, he cites congressional record for both documents. Excellent. Well, yes, very, very important question, because this is something that I've noted myself and that I'm dealing with, obviously, in the creation of my Federal Reserve documentary. There's a lot of things in the Money Masters that are just flat out false, including a lot of spurious quotations. That's something that hangs up a lot of people when it gets into this area specifically. There's a lot of quotations out there that are just flat out false. They were not said by the people that we think said them. The famous Thomas Jefferson quote about inflation and deflation leaving us homeless on the continent our forefathers conquered, what have you. Absolutely spurious. Thomas Jefferson did not say or write that. The Den of Vipers quote from Andrew Jackson, almost certainly not actually said. A lot of things like that get floated around. There's a lot of them in the Money Masters, so be very, very careful about quotations in particular. If you don't have an actual source for it, you should assume that it has been made up by someone until it is proven otherwise. I think that's the best methodology. That's why my Federal Reserve documentary, I'm being exceptionally careful to be as careful as possible with my sources. I'm not going out on speculative limbs. I'm not taking flights of fancy. I'm trying to put it as basic as I can. So again, you'll see that when it comes. But yes, the panic circular, the hazard circular, I will not attempt to describe it right now. I'll just leave it. I'll put some links in the description so you can read about them. If anyone has more information, this is my homework to you. This is not questions for Corbett, this is questions for you. If you can find a source for these that goes beyond that congressional record citation, which is 50, 100 years after the fact, if you can find an actual source document for these, please let me know. Because I'd love to see them myself. I just don't think they're out there, and that's why I'm not including them in my documentary. But hey, there's still time. There's still a few days. So if you can get in actual source documentation on these for me, not third-hand accounts, not something written decades after the fact, actual source documentation, I will gladly and lovingly put it in the documentary because it would certainly help the case if it was real.